Those who grow old enough with the topic of Chernobyl eventually move past preoccupation with rods and start thinking about the core inlet, particularly how hot and wet it was. Our suggestive narrative begins on page 7 of INSAC 7. The gist of it is don't let the core inlet get too hot and wet lest you lose control of it. This patriarchal viewpoint focuses on what it calls subcooling, or the margin of coolant's temperature under its boiling point. Furthermore, it ties a lack of subcooling to disrupting pumping action, which you don't have to be a nuclear scientist to know is a vital function. All this Section 2.8 claims was supported by analysis and experiment, so get your rigor on. We have to indulge INSAC 7 and understand the logic of the following Section 2.9 in order to perform our qualitative That Chernobyl Guy YouTuber reads stuff for 10 to 20,000 views analysis. 2.9 begins by telling us about the piping of our hysterical subject. She is a big girl, so our unfortunate Soviet brethren worked hard to provide her with not one, but two independent primary coolant loops, splitting her down the middle in half. 3 primary coolant pumps were normally used on each side to circulate pacifying fluid, with a 4th on each side serving as a backup. The discharged coolant is aggregated on each side and redistributed through all the pressure tubes spanning the core. It picks up heat from the nuclear fuel and exits the core as a mixture of steam and water. The steam is sent out from 2 steam separator drums to the 2 turbines. It is then condensed into water, called feed water, and recirculated with the remaining water that passed through the core. The normal core inlet coolant temperature is 270 Celsius, whereas the normal core outlet coolant temperature is 284 degrees under pressure. At the bottom of page 7, going into page 8, comes a crucial sentence to our collective understanding that you need to make sure you remember. Paradoxically, the temperature of the coolant going into the main circulation pumps and the core is dependent on steam production. Steam condensed into water after passing through the turbines, quote, becomes the cooler feed water component of the coolant entering the pumps and the core. So in effect, the steam produced subcools the coolant. The following sentence notes that the flow of this feed water component is decreased when power is reduced, presumably because less steam is generated, and consequently the temperature of the recirculating coolant increases. This you should also remember. Then we abruptly go into the other factor that is supposed to affect coolant temperature: coolant flow. The international section of INSAC 7 tells us that at the startup or shutdown, 2 measures are taken specifically to ensure greater subcooling or a lower coolant temperature: reduced flow per pump and the use of fewer pumps. The section ties the temperature of the coolant to cavitation or breakdown of the pumps, in addition to the coolant being close to boiling as it enters the core, and thus more susceptible to the high positive void coefficient of reactivity, whereby voiding, or steaming, begets more voiding. The next paragraph points out that just prior to the disaster, all 8 main circulation pumps were connected. This increased the coolant flow rate, reducing steam generation, but here comes one of the classic INSAC 7 kickers. Quote, in addition, owing to the lower reactor power level at that time, the core inlet coolant was only slightly subcooled and, depending on the exact settings for feed water flow and recirculation flow, and the pressure distribution in the system piping, may not have been subcooled at all. So while we're writing all about lack of subcooling and high coolant flow suppressing steam generation, and in turn subcooling feed water flow, a wild statement appears that owing to the lower reactor power level, the core inlet coolant was only slightly subcooled. The coolant flow stuff is relegated to maybe causing a complete lack of subcooling. Stated that way because, as we'll read elsewhere in the report, the data indicates there wasn't a total lack of subcooling. It may seem like we're splitting hairs, at most making much out of a sentence that seems strange. But when we make a connection to another part of the report, you'll see that this sentence isn't accidental. Rather, it's telling. These conditions, whatever they were exactly, led to the onset of boiling at or near the bottom of the core, contributing to enhanced susceptibility to positive void reactivity feedback if an increase in power were to occur. Moreover, at the higher flow rate, note here how rather than mentioning the coolant temperature, a reference is made to flow rate on this matter, the margin of pump cavitation was also reduced. We're mentioning all these things because soon enough they will come back screwy. Let's take a few minutes to structure things. 1. The root of the topic is the temperature of the coolant at the core inlet. The closer it was to boiling, as coolant entered the reactor core, the easier it was for the positive void and power coefficients to kick in and drive a destructive positive feedback loop. 2. Two factors are identified as affecting the coolant temperature at the core inlet: power level and coolant flow. There is no further breakdown of power level. It is what it is, directly controlled. But the role coolant flow plays is more elaborate. 3. In particular, INSAC 7 explains the role of the coolant flow in terms of total coolant flow. Just as with a lower power level, a higher total coolant flow results in less steam coming out of the core that in turn limits the cooler feed water flow constituted from steam condensed past the turbines. 4. Two actions are identified as causing an excessive total flow rate: the connection of all 8 main circulation pumps, and excessive flow rates in individual pumps. Let's start examining the levels from the top. The root of everything, the coolant temperature being close to boiling, is listed in the consequences column of the 1986 table of grave operating violations Soviet experts supplied to the Vienna meeting, meant to establish the narrative of Chernobyl. And yet, Deputy Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the time of the disaster and principal scapegoat Anatoly Dyatlov cites the operating regulations with respect to the coolant temperature being close to boiling in his defense. In a Nuclear Engineering International article published in 1995, titled "Why INSAC Has Still Got It Wrong," Dyatlov writes the following: "The reactor is operated only in boiling mode, and, according to the regulations, may be operated with minimal or even zero subcooling. See Regulations, Chapter 9. This condition is obligatory, since such operating conditions cannot be avoided in principle. They occur with any rise in power, when the pressure falls in the separators. Not only did the operating regulations permit operation with minimal or even zero subcooling, according to Dyatlov, but they essentially had to because a lack of subcooling was a natural condition in an RBMK reactor with changes in power." Page 64 of INSAC 7, as part of Annex 1 rather than the international part of the report, writes the following: "The thermal hydraulic operating conditions of the core were characterized by a low level of subcooling of the coolant below the boiling temperature, 3 degrees Celsius, and a correspondingly low steam quality, which was observed only in the upper part of the core. Under these circumstances, in view of the low level of subcooling of the coolant below the boiling temperature, a small power increase, for whatever reason, could result in a much higher increase in the volumetric steam quality in the lower part of the core than in the upper part. Before the tests, the core parameters were therefore such as to increase the reactor's runaway susceptibility in the lower part of the core. The Commission believes that this situation was created not only as a result of a higher than normal flow rate of coolant through the reactor, because 8 instead of the usual 6 MCPs were in operation, and an increased flow rate prevents steam generation, but primarily as a result of the low reactor power level. Similar thermal hydraulic parameters could occur during any power reduction of the reactor. These paragraphs not only support Dyatlov's contention that the coolant's temperature being close to its boiling point was not forbidden and a natural condition of the RBMK design, but also establish that the predominance of low power versus a high total coolant flow rate as a factor in the lack of subcooling. And so, let's revisit that weird sentence on page 8 amid all the writing on coolant flow. In addition, owing to the lower reactor power level at that time, the core inlet coolant was only slightly subcooled, and, depending on the exact settings for feed water flow and recirculation flow, and the pressure distribution in the system piping, may not have been subcooled at all. The core inlet coolant was not with a total lack of subcooling, and the primary factor was indeed the power level. Okay, so, the coolant being close to its boiling point at the core inlet was not against the operating instructions. What about the power level that primarily accounted for this condition? Pages 76 and 77 of INSAC 7 are pretty emphatic. The decision to carry out the turbogenerator number 8 rundown tests at a reactor power of about 200 megawatts was a departure from the testing program. However, neither the design documentation, the regulatory documentation, nor the operating documentation prohibited operation of the unit at that power. Before the Chernobyl accident, there was no safe operating limits in terms of minimum permissible thermal reactor power. In none of the documents studied by the Commission relating to the analysis of the operating conditions of the RBMK 1000 reactor do the reactor designers raise the question of the need to limit the reactor operation at power levels below a certain level. Moreover, Section 11.4 of the operating procedures required personnel to reduce the reactor power to the level corresponding to the unit's internal consumption, 200 to 300 megawatts thermal, following automatic power reduction in the EPS-3 design mode, or remotely in the event of abnormalities in the power supply system, such as frequency variations. There was no limitation on the period during which the reactor could operate at the minimum controllable power level. Not only was there no rule limiting operation at low power, but there was even an instance of a requirement to operate there. Alright, well, what about the total coolant flow rate going through the reactor core that was of secondary importance in raising the coolant temperature at the core inlet? Here we get into classic Soviet shenanigans. The table of the quote, most important provisions of the operating regulations for safe management of technological process, Chernobyl operators were accused of violating by Soviet nuclear power experts, found on pages 22 and 23 of the Soviet report to the Vienna meeting of 1986, lists violation number 3 as connecting all of the main circulation pumps to the reactor, with individual pump discharges exceeding the levels specified in the regulations. The consequence is the coolant temperature being close to its boiling point. Remember that these are the two factors we just listed as accounting for a high total coolant flow. We will, of course, get to these soon. But notice how the high total coolant flow itself isn't listed. The only instance of a total coolant flow violation is mentioned in INSAC 1, the Soviet to English translation of the deceitful, rancid goulash Soviet nuclear power experts were feeding to their international counterparts, and by extension, the world. At the bottom of page 15, we find the following sentence. The high flow created by these extra pumps was a violation of normal station procedures since it exceeded approved levels both for the reactor core and for certain individual pumps. More importantly, it made control of the main coolant systems difficult. There is no such sentence to be found in INSAC 7. We will provide the person who finds a total coolant flow violation in INSAC 7 with the hottest and wettest core inlet $1,000 can buy to escort them to the promised land. The total coolant flow was high, but not in violation of a regulation. The Soviets, as well as INSAC 1, were kind enough to spotlight the connection of the 2 extra main circulation pumps. Page 77 of INSAC 7 states, before 26 April 1986, no document, including the operating procedures, prohibited connection of all 8 MCPs to the reactor at any power level. So the coolant's temperature being close to its boiling point wasn't against the operating instructions. The primary factor to it being a low reactor power wasn't against the operating instructions. The secondary factor to it being a high total coolant flow wasn't against the operating instructions. The primary factor to the secondary factor to the coolant temperature being close to its boiling point, being the connection of the 2 extra main circulation pumps, wasn't against the operating instructions. Which leaves us with the coolant flow rate through individual pumps. If you go back and look at the language of that third grievous violation in the 1986 Soviet report to the Vienna meeting, after you get over the fact there was no total coolant flow violation, nor a connection of all main circulation pumps violation, you see a comma demarcating the boundary from lies to half-truths. It turns out the violation within a violation was in fact the only violation, which the Soviets knew as indicated by them specifying it was a violation. Like, they got so excited about there being an actual violation, they tipped their hand. First, let's contextualize before we contextualize some more. So, if we at least vaguely recall the monkey mumbo-jumbo we started the video with, on pages whatever at the beginning of INSAC 7, well, the international authors were trying to sell us on the notion that the rule limiting individual pump coolant flow rates was intended to limit the total coolant flow rate, which, in turn, was supposed to limit the coolant temperature. Except someone put that sentence in there that it was really the power mostly affecting the coolant temperature. Well, anyway, also setting aside the total coolant flow rate not being directly limited, let's compare the effect of a conservative non-violation of connecting 2 extra main circulation pumps with that of a more liberal violation of individual pump coolant flow rates on the total coolant flow. Page 77 of INSAC 7 states that the operating procedures limited the capacity of each MCP to 6,500 to 7,000 cubic meters per hour in the conditions at Chernobyl. So let's say 2 extra main circulation pumps are connected with a flow of 6,000 cubic meters per hour each, 500 to 1,000 cubic meters per hour less than the upper limit. That is an addition of 12,000 cubic meters per hour to the total flow. The individual main circulation pump flow rates are an interesting topic. Page 77 of INSAC 7 states certain MCP flow rates actually exceeded the limit. Dyatlov writes 2 to 3 did. Whereas a graph on PPITM's website based on accident.ru's Dmitriev data, both aforementioned in the Rods of Inconsistency video, indicates most if not all MCP flow rates were in violation. Let's take the most liberal view of a violation and suppose that each MCP had an excessive coolant flow rate of 1,000 cubic meters per hour. 8 times 1,000 is 8,000. 12,000 from conservative total flow coming from an extra 2 connected MCPs is 50% more than 8,000 coming from 8 MCPs, all liberally in individual flow violation. In other words, In our flowchart of coolant being close to its boiling point, the power level primarily causing it, the total coolant flow rate secondarily causing it, which the connection of two main circulation pumps primarily caused, while the excessive flow rate through individual pumps secondarily caused, the single least significant factor out of everything was the only thing in violation. So, being high IQ individuals that we all are, we immediately start wondering, what was the actual point of the upper limit of individual main circulation pump coolant flow? It's a little too suggestive the point wasn't to control the overall temperature of the coolant despite what the international INSAC 7 nitwits suggest. Unless the Soviet nuclear power experts responsible for the regulations needed to be institutionalized in other places that nowadays apparently export their talent through the southern border of the United States. Unfortunately, the Chernobyl sources we're reading do not discuss cavitation in sufficient detail without having background knowledge. On page 77 of INSAC 7, we can see that certain main circulation pumps exceeding their individual flow limit was significant, in terms of cavitation and the pumps maintaining their function. This is reinforced elsewhere, such as in Dyatlov's writing, where it is written that individual flow rate limits and cavitation were a matter of the specific pumps not breaking down. But as we can see on page 77 and elsewhere in INSAC 7, none of the pumps at Chernobyl cavitated, and they all provided coolant flow. So the next thing we did was try to crowdsource some understanding of cavitation. This comment under Tyler False's first reaction video to our channel, in which, incidentally, Mr. False repeats some misconceptions, but it remains to be seen whether we'll change his mind, is our first shot at better understanding cavitation and the individual pump coolant flow restriction. Cavitation is apparently vapor bubbles imploding. Why they're imploding rather than exploding we don't know. Vapor bubbles imploding or exploding is what can break down the pumps, and without pumps and circulating coolant, you're in a lot of trouble. Running a pressurized system is what prevents this from happening. The comment then proceeds to offer a technical explanation that is difficult to grasp. We try to get a little more clarity on Discord. Clearly the threat is a pressure drop. How does it occur? An increase in flow rate at a constriction like a pump can cause it, and a lack of pressure can lead to water boiling. This is why there was a rule specific to excessive flow rates through individual pumps. It was about pressure at the pumps, not general coolant temperature. In his article Why INSAC Has Still Got It Wrong, Dyatlov points out that pump cavitation was an initial theory to explain the disaster that has been discredited, as changes in pressure did not cause the pumps to break down. Trying to connect a violation in individual pump flow rates related to cavitation to the coolant temperature at the core inlet being close to boiling, when the phenomenon itself and its actual causes, power level, total coolant flow, and the connection of extra MCPs per the mechanism described in INSAC 7 of less steam production and thus less subcooling feed water, were not violations of operating instructions is spurious, an underhanded lie meant to paint the operators as responsible for an unstable reactor. In fact, even the feed water flow itself was at an average value for the reactor power. The Chernobyl Unit 4 operators did not raise the coolant temperature at the core inlet close to its boiling point through a series of violations. The coolant temperature being close to its boiling point at the core inlet was a natural state within permitted operating conditions. There is something else to highlight. PP Item put various data from Dmitriev's accident.ru site on a graph. Look at the purple lines at the bottom representing the coolant temperature at the main circulation pump inlets that was similar to the temperature at the core inlet. The two extra main circulation pumps were put into operation at 103 and 107. What do you notice? According to Dmitriev's data, the connection of both extra MCPs had no effect on the temperature of the coolant whatsoever. There is no increase. If this data is true, then what we have been dealing with is a red herring, something meant to mislead from what actually mattered. Soviet nuclear power experts made up a narrative of a series of grievous operating violations to scapegoat the operators and draw attention away from themselves. The connection of the two additional main circulation pumps was part of that narrative, as you can see in item number 3 on the table of the most significant violations they provided. Except the connection of these MCPs was no violation, and if this data is accurate, it did not affect the temperature at the core inlet either. It was pure misdirection. Was it maybe the increase in feedwater flow that kept the coolant temperature more or less constant, as the extra MCPs were being connected? Perhaps up to 109, as both the feedwater flow is increased and the feedwater flow temperature somehow decreases as well. But when you look at past 109, particularly in the final few minutes, there is a lack of any discernible consistency to our eyes and minds. The only striking change of coolant temperature occurs on the right side of the reactor, a reduction from the low 280 Celsius to the low 270 Celsius. Yet, how the hell does this happen on only the right side when the feedwater flow on the right side was actually lower than the feedwater flow on the left side, and the temperature of the feedwater on the right side fluctuated with the temperature of the feedwater on the left side? Thoroughly bizarre. We also thought that the temperature of the feedwater was supposed to be constant at 165 Celsius, but this was clearly not the case. Furthermore, supposedly the feedwater flow came from steam condensate past the turbines, yet you can see it going up and down dramatically, as if there was another source of feedwater flow, or it was being collected and stored in excess, available to be increased and reduced. The other, perhaps even more important reason why we find this data bizarre is that it conflicts with rod movement accompanying feedwater flow changes. If substantial feedwater flow changes don't affect the coolant temperature, then reactivity would be fairly stable, and control rod movement would be unnecessary. This conflicts with a number of sources. Did the connection of extra main circulation pumps and feedwater flow changes affect reactivity not via coolant temperature, but sheer volume of water? We have no idea. No source focuses solely on coolant volume or quantity as opposed to coolant temperature in relation to reactivity. We are left confused and with questions. We also don't know what to make of the pressure changes at the bottom. So what is the core inlet paradox? Well, it begins with a paradox. Reportedly, the RBMK relied on steam production to subcool its coolant via recirculated condensation of steam at a lower temperature than coolant recirculated directly from the reactor. Less steam production paradoxically meant hotter coolant, approaching its boiling point, which meant the reactor was more susceptible to voiding were reactivity to increase for any reason. This is identified as a factor to the Chernobyl disaster. But then the paradox grows. Neither the temperature of the coolant being close to boiling, nor the power level that primarily contributed to it being close to boiling, nor the total high coolant flow rate that secondarily contributed to the coolant being close to boiling, nor the connection of the two extra main circulation pumps that increased the total coolant flow that secondarily contributed to the coolant being close to boiling were violations of the operating instructions. The only violation of the operating instructions was an excessive flow rate through individual main circulation pumps. We learned that this was a matter of changes in pressure at the pumps, which could cause the pumps to cavitate and break down. Cavitation, however, did not occur. In other words, When we look at the actual words on the Soviet expert table of operating violation allegations, Soviet experts tossed the Soviet 2-in-1 bundle at us, which was classic Soviet deceptive marketing. They bundled a non-violation of potential significance to the Chernobyl disaster, the connection of the 2 extra main circulation pumps, with a violation that did not affect the Chernobyl disaster, banking on the booger eaters buying their crap, not realizing what is going on, paging Mr. Tyler False for a reaction. HBO Chernobyl creator Craig Mazin did not self-own by referring to the Soviets as masters of weaponized narration for nothing. While we have covered the false violation allegations against the operators a number of times, most recently in our Truth and Fiction series of videos, the Masters of Weaponized Narration series was our first and dedicated shot at explaining just how cunning and deliberate Soviet nuclear power experts were in misrepresenting the Chernobyl disaster, specifically the actions of the operators. In this video, we also took a brief look at purported data provided by one of the Soviet investigators into the disaster, a Ministry of Media machine building trained man then working for the Ministry of Energy operating the RBMKs. His data raises questions and concerns that we did not anticipate. Feel encouraged to offer feedback, whether about cavitation or anything else. Not all is clear. Lastly, let us try to remark on what role the lack of subcooling played. In short, we really don't know. The motivation of this question seems related to the stubborn notion that the operators created the multi-layered conditions for the Chernobyl disaster, conventionally thought to be through a series of willful violations. We are convinced this is exactly the effect Soviet nuclear power experts intended to achieve with their false narrative. As you just saw, lack of subcooling is actually most related to permissible changes in power and natural for an RBMK. Neither power nor high total coolant flow were against the operating instructions existing at the time. At the heart of it all is the high positive void coefficient of reactivity flipping the overall power coefficient positive, i.e. the reactor being able to run away. When you read about these coefficients of reactivity, there is no caveat that there had to be a lack of subcooling for them to be disastrous. We believe that rather than a manufactured narrative about this and that, the Chernobyl Unit 4 operators did wrong in extremely improbable conjunction for the first time in the 12-plus year history of RBMK reactor operation at the time the real key that unlocked the door of the nuclear demon let loose at Chernobyl was a shortening of the graphite sections of control rods in proximity to the disaster. We believe the disaster occurred about as early as it could, not inexplicably late. Our Rods of Inconsistency companion video, and our videos on the 1975 and 1985 Leningrad and Smolensk incidents expound. Soviet nuclear power experts hid that they misunderstood the coefficients of reactivity, that they created or augmented the positive Scram effect, and that their underlying lack of understanding of their own creation was reflected in inadequate operating instructions as well as in an inadequate monitoring, control, and protection facility that paved the road to disaster rather than the Unit 4 operators driving through walls to get there. That is the paradox of Chernobyl as a whole. How a false narrative from people you suspect you're not supposed to trust becomes quasi-fact, because it makes enough sense when you aren't looking at it closely.